Neil Armstrong almost got stranded in space before he ever walked on the moon. Most people know him for Apollo 11. They know the famous one small step line, but before that giant leap, there was a mission called Gemini 8. And it nearly went terribly wrong. It was a test of skill and nerve, and it showed exactly why Armstrong was the man for the moonshot. This wasn't just a tough moment, it was a near disaster that could have killed him and his crewmate. To understand what happened, you have to know about the Gemini program. NASA launched Project Mercury first. Those were the very first American manned space flights. They proved people could go into space. They were short trips, then came Project Gemini. Gemini was a big step up. It was meant to bridge the gap between Mercury's simple orbital flights and the much more complex Apollo missions that would go to the moon. Gemini had 2 astronauts, not just one. This let them do more things. They learned how to maneuver in space. They practiced spacewalks called extravehicular activities or EVAs, and most importantly for Gemini 8, they learned how to rendezvous and dock with another spacecraft. That was the whole point of Gemini 8. Rendezvous and docking were critical skills for Apollo. When astronauts went to the moon, their lander would separate from the main spacecraft. It would go down to the moon's surface. After their mission, the lander would lift off. It then had to find and link up with the orbiting command module. If they couldn't dock, the astronauts would be stuck. They couldn't get back to Earth. So Gemini 8 was a crucial test of this very hard maneuver. It was the first time anyone would try to dock 2 spacecraft together in orbit. It had never been done before by any country. Neil Armstrong was chosen as the commander for Gemini 8. His pilot was David Scott. Armstrong was known as an excellent test pilot. He flew X-15 rocket planes. He was quiet, calm, and incredibly smart. People said he had ice water in his veins. He didn't panic under pressure. These were all traits that NASA valued highly. He had a natural ability to stay focused when things went bad. Scott was a sharp young Air Force pilot. He was also a quick thinker. Together, they were a strong crew. They spent countless hours training for this mission. They studied every system. They practiced every possible problem they could think of. But space always finds a way to surprise you. The mission had a clear goal launch, rendezvous with an uncrewed Agena target vehicle, and then dock with it. After that, Scott would perform a spacewalk. It was all about proving NASA could do these complex tasks. The Agena was a rocket stage modified to act as a target. It had its own engine and thrusters. The Gemini capsule would meet it in orbit, approach carefully, and then connect, latching on with a probe and drogue system. It sounds simple when you say it quickly, but it was incredibly precise work. Both spacecraft were moving at thousands of miles per hour. They needed to match their speed and position perfectly. A tiny mistake could lead to a collision, or they could miss each other entirely. Then the docking would fail. NASA was pushing the limits of technology and human capability. Everyone knew it was a risky flight, but no one expected the kind of trouble they were about to face. The stakes were very high. Success meant a clearer path to the moon. Failure, especially a catastrophic one, could set the entire Apollo program back years. The whole world was watching, eager to see if this complex dance in space could really be pulled off. The day of launch was March 16th, 1966. It was a bright morning at Cape Kennedy. The Gemini 8 rocket stood tall on the pad. Inside were Armstrong and Scott, strapped into their small capsule. The countdown proceeded smoothly. At 11:41 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the engines roared to life. The rocket slowly lifted off. It climbed into the sky, shaking the ground. It was a powerful, violent ride. Armstrong and Scott were pushed hard into their seats by the G-forces. They made it through the atmosphere. Then they were in orbit. Everything was normal. The first big step was to launch the Agena target vehicle. This happened about 100 minutes before Gemini 8 took off. The Agena went into orbit first. It waited for Gemini 8 to catch up. After Gemini 8 was safely in orbit, Armstrong and Scott started the chase. Their job was to fly their spacecraft to meet the Agena. This was a challenging task itself. They had to make careful burns with their thrusters. These small rocket firings changed their speed and direction. They slowly closed the distance between their capsule and the Agena. It took several hours of precise flying. The astronauts used their radar and telescopes to track the target. They made course corrections. Every step had to be perfect. As they got closer, the Agena became visible. It looked like a gleaming metallic cylinder against the blackness of space. It was a thrilling sight. Armstrong, with his calm demeanor, guided the Gemini. Scott was busy calling out data and checking their systems. They made their final approach. It was like trying to park a car, but at thousands of miles per hour and in 3 dimensions. Slowly, carefully, Armstrong brought the Gemini spacecraft toward the Agena's docking port. He lined it up. The probe on the front of Gemini aimed for the drug on the Agena. It was a delicate dance. At 6 hours and 33 minutes into the flight, they made contact. A click signaled the latches had engaged. Gemini 8 was docked with the Agena. Armstrong called out, "Flight, we are docked! Yes, we are locked on!" There was cheering in Mission Control in Houston. It was a huge success, the first successful docking in space. Everyone was relieved and excited. It meant the plan for Apollo could really work. They had done it. They had achieved the primary goal of the mission. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. Armstrong and Scott checked the systems. The connection was solid. The two spacecraft were now one. They were flying in formation linked together. But this moment of triumph would soon turn into one of the most dangerous situations in space history. No one on the ground or in space expected what was about to happen next. They planned to stay docked for a few hours. And Scott would go out for a spacewalk. The crew was monitoring all the systems. They felt good about their achievement. The world watched, proud of this new milestone. Soon after docking, things started to go wrong. It began subtly. Armstrong noticed the spacecraft was slightly off attitude. It was rotating very slowly. He thought it was probably the Agena. The Agena had its own propulsion system. It was programmed to keep a stable attitude, so Armstrong sent a command to the Agena to correct its position. But the rotation didn't stop. In fact, it started to speed up. Armstrong fired the Gemini's thrusters to try and stop the rotation. But it didn't work. The problem wasn't going away, it was getting worse. Armstrong and Scott realized something was seriously wrong. The linked spacecraft were starting to spin faster and faster. They were tumbling. Imagine being inside a washing machine, but in space, and the spin just keeps building. The forces inside the capsule started to increase. It became harder to move. It became harder to see clearly. The instrument panel was a blur. The stars outside were streaking past the windows. But Armstrong and Scott were trying to figure out what was happening. Was it the Agena? Was it their own Gemini? They couldn't tell for sure. They tried to use Gemini's thrusters again. They fired them to counter the spin. But the spin kept getting faster. It was now one revolution every few seconds. This was dangerous. The G-forces were building. Astronauts can get disoriented and sick. They can even lose consciousness. They knew they were in serious trouble. Mission Control was also seeing the telemetry data. The ground controllers could see the spacecraft was rotating, but they weren't getting all the information right away. There was a slight delay. They were also trying to understand what was going on. They suggested Armstrong use the Agena's systems to stop the spin, but Armstrong had already done that. The situation was getting critical. The spin rate was now over 1 revolution per second. Armstrong and Scott were pinned against their seats. Their vision was blurring. Their blood was being pulled away from their heads. They knew they had to act fast. They thought the problem had to be with the Agena. They decided to undock. They thought if they separated from the Agena, they could regain control of their own spacecraft. It was a risky move. Undocking while spinning wildly could make things even worse. It could send them flying off in an uncontrolled direction, or they could hit the Agena. But they had no other choice. Armstrong initiated the undocking sequence. He pushed the button. The latches released. Gemini 8 separated from the Agena. For a moment, they hoped that the spin would stop. They hoped it was just the Agena that was malfunctioning. But, to their horror, the Gemini spacecraft kept spinning. It was still tumbling just as fast as before. This meant the problem was with their own spacecraft. One of Gemini's thrusters was stuck on. It was firing continuously. This constant thrust was making them spin. They had thought they had fixed the problem by undocking, but they had not. They were still in a death trap, spinning uncontrollably, but now completely on their own, far from any help. The spin was so fast that Scott began to get dizzy and nauseated. He struggled to read the instrument, so Armstrong remained calm. He knew he had to figure out which thruster was stuck and how to stop it. Their lives depended on it. Armstrong knew they were in deep trouble. The Gemini capsule was still spinning out of control. It was now rotating at about 1 revolution per second. That's extremely fast. They were experiencing strong G-forces. It was hard to think. It was hard to see. But Armstrong kept his composure. He had to find the stuck thruster. The Gemini had 16 small thrusters. They were used for maneuvering. There were 8 thrusters for attitude control and 8 for translation. One of the 8 attitude control thrusters, specifically number 8, was stuck in the on position. It was firing continuously. This was causing the violent spin. Trying to diagnose which thruster was stuck while spinning so fast was almost impossible. But Armstrong had an idea. He toggled the control system between its different modes. He was looking for any change in the spin rate. He did this while also trying to fire other thrusters to counteract the spin. It was like trying to drive a car with the accelerator stuck on and no brakes, while also trying to fix the engine. Finally, he identified the culprit. It was one of the orbit attitude control thrusters. The problem was that these thrusters were linked to the main maneuvering system. He couldn't just turn off one individual thruster from that system. He had to do something more drastic. Armstrong made a quick, critical decision. He decided to turn off the main orbit attitude and maneuvering system, or OMS, entirely. This was a bold move. It meant he would lose all the primary thrusters for controlling the spacecraft. But his only way to stop the stuck thruster from firing. If he shut off the OMS, he would have to rely on a completely separate system. This was the Reentry Control System, or RCS. The RCS was meant only for controlling the capsule during reentry into Earth's atmosphere. It had its own set of thrusters. It was a backup system. Using it in orbit would mean burning precious fuel needed for landing. But if they didn't stop the spin, they wouldn't make it to reentry anyway. Armstrong flipped the switches. He shut down the OMS. Then he activated the RCS thrusters. Slowly, painstakingly, he used the RCS to fight the spin. The spacecraft was still tumbling, but with the stuck thruster off, he could finally gain some control. It was like wrestling a wild animal. He fired the RCS thrusters in short, precise bursts. The rotation began to slow. First, it went from 1 revolution per second to 1 revolution every few seconds. Then, it slowed even further. Eventually, Armstrong brought the Gemini spacecraft to a complete stop. They were stable again. The crisis was over. But they had used up a lot of their RCS fuel in the process. Because they had to use the reentry system in orbit, they no longer had enough fuel for a safe reentry later in the mission. NASA rules stated that if they used more than half of the reentry control fuel, they had to abort the mission and come home early. This meant their spacewalk was canceled. The rest of their mission objectives were also scrubbed. They had to land. Mission Control, after catching up with all the data, confirmed the decision. They quickly calculated a new landing trajectory. Armstrong and Scott prepared for an emergency landing. They were over the Pacific Ocean. The nearest recovery ships were thousands of miles away. The new landing zone was in an area where the Navy had no ships stationed, but there was no time to wait. They strapped in for re-entry. The capsule hit the atmosphere. It glowed red-hot from the friction. Parachutes deployed. The small capsule splashed down in the ocean, about 500 miles southeast of Okinawa. They were far from the planned landing site. It took 3 hours for a Navy destroyer, the USS Mason, to reach them. A pararescue team jumped from an aircraft. They secured the capsule and waited with Armstrong and Scott until the ship arrived. They were safe, but it had been a very close call. They had faced a life-threatening situation and emerged victorious because of Armstrong's cool head and quick actions. The Gemini 8 crew was safe, but the events of their mission sent shockwaves through NASA. An immediate investigation began. Engineers wanted to know exactly what went wrong. They found that the number 8 thruster on the Gemini spacecraft had failed. It was an electrical issue. A short circuit caused it to fire continuously. This was a serious design flaw. It was quickly corrected on all future Gemini and Apollo missions. The incident highlighted the importance of backup systems. It also showed the need for clear procedures for dealing with unexpected failures in space. The near disaster also had a profound impact on Neil Armstrong's reputation. He had demonstrated incredible calm under extreme pressure. He diagnosed a complex problem, he made critical decisions, and he brought the spacecraft under control, all while facing forces that could have made many people panic. This wasn't just bravery, it was a testament to his intelligence, his training, and his almost superhuman ability to remain composed. These qualities were exactly what NASA needed for the Apollo program. Landing on the moon was going to be even more dangerous and complex. They needed someone who could handle anything. Armstrong proved he was that person. David Scott, the pilot, also showed great resilience. He worked alongside Armstrong, providing crucial information and support, even while battling the disorientation from the spin. The crew's teamwork was a key factor in their survival. They were a strong unit, and their ability to communicate and work together during the crisis was vital. The lessons learned from Gemini 8 were invaluable. NASA implemented changes to thruster design and wiring. They improved emergency procedures. They also revised rules for how much fuel a spacecraft needed for various parts of a mission, especially for re-entry. The incident showed that even the most meticulously planned missions could face unforeseen problems. It reinforced the idea that human ingenuity and quick thinking were just as important as the technology itself. The space was still a wild frontier. For Armstrong, Gemini 8 was a critical stepping stone, not just to the moon, but to shaping the kind of astronaut he would become. He always remained humble about the incident. He often said he and Scott were just doing their job. But everyone else knew it was more than that. It was a display of extraordinary skill. It prepared him for the unforeseen challenges of Apollo 11. Years later, during the Apollo 11 moon landing, Armstrong would once again face a critical decision. He had to take manual control of the lunar module and steer it away from a boulder field. He did it calmly and successfully. Many say the experience with Gemini 8 was a direct precursor to that moment. It honed his instincts and confirmed his ability to operate under the most extreme stress. So, while Neil Armstrong is celebrated for his walk on the moon, his lesser-known experience on Gemini 8 is just as important. It was a moment where he and David Scott faced almost certain death. They almost got stranded, spinning out of control in Earth orbit. But they survived. It was a testament to human courage, skill, and the relentless drive to push the boundaries of what's possible. It taught NASA crucial lessons, and it firmly cemented Neil Armstrong as the right man to lead humanity's greatest adventure, the first journey to another celestial body. His calmness in the face of chaos during Gemini 8 was a preview of the leadership he would display when he finally made that one small step on the lunar surface. It showed the world that even in the vast, unforgiving vacuum of space, human ingenuity could prevail against the unexpected.